want to say is what a delight it is that so many of you, so many of us, are here with the intention of sharing this morning. I'd like to thank the local women for their leadership of our introductory worship, the tone setting and the ethos making. But I'd really like to thank you for being here. I feel that the expertise is in the room here, and what I want to do in the next 45 minutes, and I have been reminded by Nina, who shall remain nameless, that I have the capacity to extend what I'm saying at great length. I'd like in this 45 minutes for us to share and reflect as I'm not doing a Bible study with a passage. What I want to do is do what Jill Baker did far better than I will at the World Assembly, and mine the scriptures to create an overview of our theme and the theme that we have in front of us. And in the midst of that, there will be gaps and opportunities for people to think and reflect. We'll take some time for silence, and then I've brought together the chunk of the questions at the end in the hopes that we get that far. The first problem, of course, if you might want to take a moment now, either to have a Bible in front of you, and these don't seem to be any Bibles in the pews, but if you have a Bible on your phone, you might, some of you have got pew Bibles, that's great, you might not want to use them. If you've got a Bible on your phone, if you prefer to use that as I do, then please take a moment to get out your phones and get yourselves ready. You may not want to look up any passages, but it may be that in speaking you might think, oh yes, that's made me think about this one. So I always feel more comfortable in a Bible study if people have Bibles that they have access to. It just seems to me to root and ground what we're doing. Of course, the difficulty of doing a Bible study on a theme like simplicity of lifestyle is that we are introducing a very modern concept into something which was more or less sealed 2,000 years ago. The Bible does not address the subject of simplified living or simplicity of lifestyle, just like it doesn't address the subject of artificial intelligence. And if we sometimes take what it says in the scriptures and we apply them to nowadays, we find ourselves in I'm not sure it's a comfortable position or not. I watched a video this week actually on possibly TikTok. I've never watched TikTok before. I think young people call it TikTok, but you know. And it was of a young Jewish woman who is an Orthodox woman. And the video was about her going to get a new wig because Orthodox women shave their heads. And the heading of the video was, why do Orthodox women shave their heads? So I watched 10 minutes of this video, which was great. The wigs were gorgeous, the colours, it was lovely. But I watched 10 minutes of this before she said, why do Orthodox women shave their heads? And the answer was, we don't know. She said, God said he'd like us to do this. So that's obviously a Jewish way of reading the Hebrew Bible. God said that when we are married, this is something that we should do. God has a pattern for the world, and sometimes we don't know one of the things we do should fit into that pattern, but that's an important part of the pattern. Now, it might be that your view of the Bible is like that, and that you do not have polycotton sheets. I love a polycotton sheet. I love the loveliness of fresh cotton, but I also love the loveliness of not ironing. Well, the Bible says you can't mix fibres, doesn't it? So no polycotton sheets, no shellfish, no prawn sandwich, blah, 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 blah. Now, that means, to my mind, and you may think about this differently, that we cannot simply take scripture and plop it down where we are. So what I want to do is pick out 6 different things in scripture and think about them, or for you to think about them in your contemporary context. I am going to try and follow my notes. I am going to try and stop the microphone from rustling. I've been having a bit of eye trouble, and I might have to give up with the notes or whatever, but we'll try that. So the first thing that I would like to pull out, I started with this image here, and this quote from, are you going to come and help me stop rustling? Oh, okay. This quote from the Sermon on the Mount, I'm not sure what translation it is, but Jesus saying about how, consider the lilies of the field, worry not about the stuff that you have. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. And the picture, which you'll probably barely be able to see, but the picture, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Mike, for the math. Thank you, Matt, for the mic. The picture was one of a series of pictures. And the picture is what happens if people take everything they own out of their house and put it on the front lawn. And there's this series of pictures from around the world where people have taken everything out of their house, all their possessions, and put them on the front lawn. I'm not sure that it's an interesting thing. It's a really interesting thing. It's interesting to compare the abundance of possessions of some houses and other houses. But I'm not sure that that's where we're going with this, actually, because, I understand that not everybody has a washing machine, but blinking heck, it's a blinking good thing to have. And I don't think that we're saying if you've got all this, you're somehow a wrong person. But it is a lovely picture, isn't it? And a lovely image to think about. So the first thing that I do want to pull out from the scriptures is that there is a strong and significant thread which says that our life does not exist in the abundance of our possessions. Now, there's lots of passages for this. I picked out this passage from 1 Timothy. Projection is not the strongest in this venue, and that's why it's quite good if you've got something to look at in front of you. This is 1 Timothy 6:6, where Paul says, "Godliness with contentment is great gain. We brought nothing into this world, and it's certain that we carry nothing out. Having food and clothing, with these we shall be content." And then it goes on to talk about how other things distract us from this message, how other things sort of lead us astray. Now, I think this tells us, within this one passage, some of the themes that we might draw out. The Bible does not have a picture of eco-warriors. I'm grateful for the eco-warriors amongst us. That is excellent. But I don't think it's biblical any more than shaving off your hair and wearing a wig is possibly biblical. That's a judgmental statement. I didn't mean that. This is not really about being an eco-warrior. The theme consistently is a valuing of sufficiency. I saw a lovely passage from a book the other day, and it was about two American authors. I can't remember who they were, but I think one of them was Kurt Vonnegut. So it's those American authors from the period of the 1950s, Jack Kerouac and those sorts of people. Don't matter who they were. But they were both famous and are known today. And they were at the party in the house of somebody who had a really, really prestigious lifestyle. And apparently one of them said to the other, no matter how famous we get, or you get, you'll never have all of this. And the other one apparently turned around to him and said, it doesn't matter actually, because I've got something that he, the house owner guy, will never have. And the other writer said, oh yeah, and what's that then? And he said, I have enough. And I thought that was a lovely line. I think that is, I think that's great in itself. I remember when I got married when I was 22, and we'd been married not but a few months. And I walked down the street. I think we'd perhaps been married a year, and we had our own little house, big mortgage, but our own little house. And I walked down towards our own little house. And on the drive was our own little car, third or fourth hand, but it was our own little car. And in the window was our own little dog. And I remember thinking, what more can I want? I've got the husband, the car, the dog, and the house. What's the next 40 years about? I remember that just 40 odd years ago, but I remember that strong sense of sufficiency. And I suppose that although that's not a biblical message, if most of this world, if the rich world and the rich of this world had that sense of sufficiency, then actually we'd be in a much better place. But in the New Testament, as we see in this passage, sufficiency is not just an attitude towards life. That's not where the emphasis is. The emphasis is that it's an attitude towards life with God. What the Bible is telling us is that it is God that is enough. It's not the car, the dog, the husband and the little house. It is God that is enough. Now, I'd be interested for you to talk about what that means in your head. I think it's a Christian belief, so it's probably a belief in some way that people in this room hold. But how you hold, that might be quite different. Some of you might say, it is enough because I know that I am saved. I am free from fear at an existential level. That's not my language, I think, but that might very well be your language. That's fine. None of us knows what it means. How you say it is your choice. I think I'd say it's enough because I know that I am loved, that I belong, and I have a purpose that gets me out of bed in the morning. I think that's how I would talk about sufficiency. Somebody else might say, I have enough. It is enough because I have my hand in the hand of the man who stills the waters. That is enough. It is enough. Of course, there's a danger in this kind of contentment. Marx levelled it as a great danger against religion. It makes religion the opiate of the people. People convince you that you've got enough because you've got God, so that's all right with the world then. And, you pray for your daily bread today. You didn't worry about bread tomorrow. As long as you're content and poor, that's fine. We know that that is a great danger, to encourage people to put up just with their daily bread. And I think the other side of this, and these are just further passages, Paul in Philippians, I've learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased and I know how to abound. Everywhere in all things I have learned how to be full, how to be hungry, how to be abounding, how to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And also in Proverbs, and this is taking us on to this next point, because part of what affects us is not the sufficiency of God, but the nature of the God in whom we have sufficiency. I've been married, as I said, for 40-something years. And we got married when we were 22, when I'd just finished my PGCE and we'd left university. And I sometimes wonder a lot of things, and if my husband was here, he could probably say, yes, I wonder a lot of those things too. I wonder what I would be like now, who I would be now, if I'd not been with that particular person for the last 40-odd years, since leaving college, since going out into the world on my own, being with that person. And I wonder what he'd be like. And I wonder what any of my friends would be like, or any of you would be like, had, two paths converged in a yellow wood, supposing you'd married somebody else, or not got married, or got married. How might you be different? How am I different? How are we different? Because of the God with whom we have sufficiency. Because, as this thing in Proverbs says, two things I request of you. And the latter part, the first part is that I don't get satisfied with the wrong things, but also, in case I profane the name of God because I am poor and I steal, that we lose by our disconnection from God the life of the lifestyle that God calls us to. Our life with God shapes us in the same way that all our long-term relationships do. Our call to simpleness is shaped by the demands that the one in whom we have sufficiency puts on us. An easy yoke, Jesus says it is an easy yoke, but it's a yoke that calls us to love and not exploit our neighbour, to love and not abuse our planet. The prophets of the Hebrew Bible take a very strong line on God as a God of justice, of restoration, of welcome for the stranger in the land. Because I have sufficiency, I can live a balanced life which is sufficient in me and generous to the world around me. And so I can pursue God's justice with comfort. I can pursue restoration because I have nothing to fear. I can pursue welcome for the stranger because I know I am welcome. Welcoming others is no threat to me. I can pursue the good of the land because I know that the land is God's home. This is the balance that sufficiency brings me. Better a little with righteousness than much gain with injustice. And so, just a minute to ponder. How do you sense God's enoughness? What are the touching points between a sense of God being enough and how you live? How does your understanding of what God is like inspire you to recalibrate what we are like, what you are like? As you understand more of the nature of God, how does it change how you think about what you are like, what your nature is like? The thing I'd like to look at second is the fact that it's a question of what sort of life God intends for us. Does God intend us to live simply? Well, having just said yes, I'm not sure that's the whole answer, because the Bible is also slightly ambivalent about simplicity. In John 10:10, Jesus says, I have come, sorry, I'll head this way where the microphone is, I have come that you might have life and have it. Now, we often translate that, and have it in all its fullness. And we often spiritualise that. We often say, fullness of life, a strongly rooted spiritual life, a life rooted and grounded in God. That's not necessarily wrong. But the actual translation of the word that we tend to translate fullness is abundance. And what Jesus says is that I've come so that you might have a life with abundance. And we might spiritualise that. We might say abundant life, abundance of life. But actually, if you look at the use of the word abundance in the Bible, abundance means lots of it. My cup overflows. You have prepared not a bit of a quick sandwich for me. You have prepared a banquet before me. My cup overflows. When Jesus says, Solomon in his glory was not robed as gloriously as the lilies of the field, he doesn't say, what an idiot Solomon was. Nobody criticises Solomon. Solomon's glory, this is my picture of Solomon. The internet, funnily enough, doesn't have a lot of photos of Solomon in his glory. But Proverbs, your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. Now, I'm not straying into the prosperity gospel bit here, but I think it's just worth noting that when Jesus spoke and when people heard him and they heard that word abundance, this was their frame of reference. They weren't thinking, I'll have a rich prayer life and I'll go to church every Sunday. They were thinking abundance. God intends for us that our cups run over. And you can understand that in a biblical community, that was where people were focused, because life, like we've experienced it through the pandemic, and as people are beginning to experience now in a cost of living crisis, and as people who go far enough back to remember the war, I don't remember the war, but I remember playing on bomb sites when I was a child. People who've known the difficult times know how you long for abundance. You know, in COVID, we longed for an abundance of contact. I hate going out. I hate being with other people. But in COVID, I was scratching at the windows. You know, let me out. Let me be with other people. Let's have a party in the garden. Let's meet with loads of people. We can understand that biblical people who lived in such a vulnerable situation with harvests that came and went, wars that came and went, invasions, that they longed for security and abundance. Now, I think I like this message a bit because I am not averse to a bit of doer Protestantism. I'm not sure whether that applies to other people in the room. I was brought up to be a bit doer. We're not Scottish, we are Yorkshire people. And I resonated, I was on at Laund Abbey, which is a Christian conference centre. And there was an elderly vicar with a little gaggle of ladies with him. And he was making cups of tea at the machine. You know, a heap of tea bags and a machine of water. And he picked the tea bag out of the second cup and he said, I think we could get a third cup out of this. That resonates with me, though I will generally, I'll try and stop at 2. It's only recently that I've been directed to the quote from Isaiah where God promises a crown of beauty instead of ashes. If we've got ashes, we might feel satisfied, but that's not God's intention for us. The intention is that we have a crown of beauty. I've always felt, you know, if I haven't got ashes, I'm not doing it right. If it ain't hurting, it isn't working. And yet, what Jesus says what Isaiah says we should be living in is under a crown of beauty. And that if we've got an ashes period, that's not actually the picture that God creates. But I'm also clear that my life could actually be more abundant if it were more simple. Jesus says to Martha, 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 you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed. Now, I suspect that Methodist women as a body have trouble with the whole Martha and Mary passage. Jesus praising Mary for sitting there and doing jigger all, and Martha getting told off for running around like a headless chicken. But I think that when we caricature it like that, we've actually perhaps got it slightly wrong. I think the emphasis comes in this bit that says, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things. Few things are needed. I don't think that's about possessions. I think it's about having that sort of, what was her name? Marie Kondo approach to life, where you trim off some of the stuff so that you can enjoy more that which matters. And I have to ask myself sometimes, if I lived more simply, actually, would I have greater abundance? It's a difficult point in my life when I had some difficult choices to make. Someone, not a person from church, but a coach that I was given to work with, said to me, but what gladdens your heart? And the idea that you were allowed to have a glad heart, that you were allowed to choose things, not just because they were duty or because God wants you to do this, but because it gladdens your heart. That was a bit of a wet fish in the face moment for me. And it's funny because I talked to Graham about what it's like to be president, and he says, oh, I'm just enjoying it. When I was vice president and people said, are you enjoying it? I was like, what? Enjoy? Enjoy? I'm supposed to enjoy it? You know, I've got to train to Derby and then I've got to get to, you know, enjoy. No, I'll do what this is my duty, I have to do this. Having spoken to Graham, I realised the word joy is very biblical. And although I might not yet have relaxed enough to enjoy things, the idea of being in joy is really attracting me. It's driving my husband mad because I'll go, you know, like we're out walking the dog on a morning by the canal and the sun's shining. I'll say, I am in joy. But to actually say, you know, in this place here, I am in joy here. This is where joy is to be found. And these words, glad and joy, are very biblical. So what does abundance mean to you? If you lived more simply, would you have more fullness? Or what for you is the relationship between simplicity and gladness of heart? Simplify your life then. Is that a simple or a complicated thing? I think the Bible's a bit conflicted about this. There really is a very strong biblical tradition, New Testament tradition, that says rely on God and not so much on yourself. The Sermon on the Mount, therefore I tell you, don't worry about your life, about what you're going to eat and what you're going to wear. Is not life more than this? And I'm sure that you can think of other passages in a similar vein. The Beatitudes, blessed are the poor. Doesn't look like that, doesn't feel like that. And I wonder how, when you read, do not worry about what you're going to eat and what you're going to wear, it's a bit like men at Christmas. I grew up when women weren't ordained, and I listened to so many Christmas morning sermons with vicars standing in the pulpit saying, people shouldn't be fussing about the turkey. Well, my mother wasn't coming to church because she was so busy fussing about the turkey and the present. And I think it's often very easy to dismiss the things that have to be done as things you shouldn't worry about. We've got people coming for a meal on Thursday. I know my husband will say, stop fussing about it. But the woman who's coming has said, I said, do you eat, what don't you eat? And she said, I don't eat anything that's been in water. Can I wash a carrot? I am worried about many things. And Jesus saying, don't worry, but I am taken with the story, not so much as, I don't know why that's there. It's a very nice picture of a carmine bee eater. I'm taken with the story. It's a story of the rich young ruler. I'm not going to read it. You know the story. Rich man goes to Jesus and says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, you know that already. You've read it. And it boils down to Jesus saying, okay, get rid of your money and give your life to God. And he goes away very unhappy because he's a person with a lot of money. And I once heard a sermon on that. And the person preaching it said, it was a lovely little story. It's of a guy who goes to the minister and says to him, I try all my life and yet I can't find God. And the minister opens the Bible and finds the word God and says, can you find God now? Can you see the word God? And he says, yeah, sir. And the minister gets a sixpence out. You can tell how old this story is. And he puts it on the Bible and he says, can you see God now? It's a very simple story, but a very attractive one, I think. So there is a strand that says we need to strip away not everything in our lives, but the things that come between us and closest to God. A strand that says that simplicity isn't the point in itself, but the simplicity is important because it enables us to lean more into God. I grew up fairly poor, and it's been a thing of my life to avoid that kind of vulnerability that poverty gives you. But that is a principle. Vulnerability is the principle at the heart of the incarnation. Paul says that Jesus did not hold equality with God as a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself and made himself humble. And one thing we notice about Jesus, of course, is he didn't just step down from being God, he stepped down from his work, from his family carpentry business, from everything else. Paul describes this again in 2 Corinthians. Here. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that who is rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that through his poverty you might become rich. But, if you read the Philippians passage carefully, the upshot is, the last line, he goes on to the line, therefore God has highly exalted him. So the reward of the poverty is not endless poverty, it's not endless vulnerability, it's not endless emptying. The reward is actually greater fullness. And the quote from 2 Corinthians, where Paul is saying to the Corinthians, give money, give money. He's saying it because he's having to raise money for the congregation in Jerusalem. Why did the congregation in Jerusalem need money? Because if you remember in Acts 2, they sold everything they had and gave it to the poor. And then Jesus didn't come back within the next 5 minutes, and they were left in poverty. And Paul had to raise, it's really actually quite a manipulative quote. So it seems to me that the New Testament message is a little bit more complicated. Jesus says we should live more simply. He said he's among us as one who serves. If we want to be great, we should find that by serving. That is definitely where the weight of the text sits. But it also says that we should be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. That we need to live in the world. And the world needs Christians, like Rachel here, who's just telling me about her work, who can engage in the world and challenge the world in its complexities and not run away from the world's complexities. We could all go and live on a mountaintop. What of Jesus himself? Do you remember the old film Gandhi? I know it almost word for word because as an RE teacher, I showed it to year 9. I taught 8 groups of year 9. So I watched it 8 times in each year. And, let's say I showed it for 10 years. I knew it very well. And Gandhi, of course, lives this life of poverty. He wears a homespun loincloth, etc., etc. There's a lovely line in the film where some of his friends are talking, and they're all suited and booted and everything. And one turns around and says to Gandhi, do you know how much it costs to keep you in poverty? And I knew somebody at university, I don't know him, I don't know if I ever met him, his name was John T. Blake. Is he in the room? Anybody married to John T. Blake? No. This guy, who was famous, I learned his name. He gave his, in those days we used to get a student grant, sorry, younger people in the room. And he gave his grant away, and he lived on, he didn't have a college room, he slept on other people's floors. It was the same principle, it cost other people to keep him in his famous poverty. And Jesus said, foxes have their holes and the birds of the air have their nests. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. But we do know from Luke 8:2 that Jesus was funded in his ministry. He was able to do this because of the gifts of a group of professional women. And they were women, no doubt, like you are or have been, women with all the pressures on their lives as women, with families and jobs, and they were subbing Jesus out of their own pockets. And we know that some of the disciples, yes, they laid it all down and they followed me, but we also know they kept the family business open because they went back to fishing when Jesus meets them after the resurrection. It's not that simple. Or maybe simplicity is a more complicated word than we reckon. But one of the things that does interest me in relation to Jesus and this is the number of times that of Jesus we can use the word borrowed. The birth story of Jesus, it's a famous story, I've been telling it for 2,000 years. It hinges on a borrowed stable and a borrowed manger borrowed from sheep and cows, a stable borrowed from who? It ends in a borrowed tomb. And throughout the story, the borrowed donkey, the borrowed upper room, borrowed, Jesus being able to do what he can do because he lives in reciprocity with other people. He'll heal this person's mother-in-law, he'll turn their water into wine, but they also give to him. Jesus lives in a borrowing relationship. A great example of this is when Jesus encounters the Samaritan woman at the well in John 4. And the woman he says to the woman, give me a drink, and they have all that long talk. But one of the things she says to him, not word for word, but she says something like, how did you think you were going to get a drink anyway, because you haven't got a bucket? So Jesus is there and he's at the well, he's in the right, but he can't. Jesus can't, because he hasn't got a bucket. Little lad, feed the 5,000. Little lad, you can start with my bread and my fish. It's a reciprocal relationship. So often the church challenges me to be the one who gives. The church says to me, be like that little boy, share your fish and your loaves. But Jesus' simple living also calls us to receive, to be receivers, to acknowledge how much of our life is shared with others, borrowed from others, independence on others, and to be gracious receivers, to be people in community recognising our dependence on others. Something I've seen people asking a lot, there's a bit of a meme on Facebook that I've seen a number of times recently, and it says, and it always changes the location, it says only in Yorkshire or only in the north or whatever, do people get off the bus and thank the bus driver? Well, I think, no, put your hand up here if you don't thank the bus driver. Ha! You wouldn't admit it anyway. Yes, it's his job, but we are gracious receivers of what other people have to share with us. I have a Buddhist begging bowl. I couldn't bring it. I got in the attic to get it, but then I couldn't get underneath everything. I was Barbara the Burrower, talking about Jesus the Borrower. A Buddhist monk of that particular tradition lives entirely dependent on what people put in their begging bowl. And if it's not in your bowl, you don't get to eat it. If there's nothing in your bowl, you don't get to eat. When Buddhist monks first came to Wolverhampton, they went really hungry because nobody knew we had to feed them. And they went around with their bowls, and everybody was like, the bloke with a bowl down there, what's that about? But whatever's in your bowl is what you eat. I couldn't do that. I like to choose. That vulnerability. What do you need from others? How do you feel about being a receiver? How do you show grace in receiving? How does being vulnerable make you feel? Two stories I want to end with. The first is a reminder that for many people in our world, simplicity is not a choice. And I think it's really important to say that. To say that the story that I picked out here was the story of Elijah and the widow in 1 Kings, but where he goes to the widow and says almost rudely, I think, get us a drink and I'll have some of that bread to eat. And she just says to him, that is the last of the bread. This is the last flour. I'll make you a loaf, but we will then have to just go and die. And of course, then the miracle happens and they stay alive. But the fact that people live such a hand-to-mouth existence, I have lived an impoverished existence, but I've never lived that hand-to-mouth existence. I have worked with children coming from houses like that. I remember doing a home visit to the woman who helped out with our choir. And when she conducted the choir, she used to wear a green velvet dress, floor length, Audrey Hepburn collar, gorgeous. And her daughter was in a lot of trouble, and the head and I went round to the house, and there was nothing except one of our RE department worksheets blue tacked to the wall because it had a picture of Jesus on it. You go in houses and you are taken aback by the reality of people's lives. On both sides of my family, when you look back through ancestry.doodah, in both sides of my family, my great-grandparents, as children, at some point you find them, you find a record of this person in the workhouse, and one of them at Christmas. It's not and yet that is the story. And the Bible has a lot to say about a life in a world where people are eye-wateringly rich and others are allowed to live in depth of poverty. The Bible is very strong on that. And as that becomes increasingly a feature of our national life, the Bible has a very strong message. And then, perhaps my favourite woman in the Bible, the story of Rizpah. Rizpah, who uses simplicity as a form of protest. It's a long story. It's in 2 Samuel 21. If you don't know it, don't find it now, but make a point of going away and looking at the story of Rizpah. Rizpah lives in Israel at a time when things are going badly wrong. As I put the news on this morning and turned it off again. Echoes here. Things are going very badly wrong. And the king goes to the prophets and says, what's going wrong? And they said, something went wrong in that war with Saul, and we've got to put it right. And so the solution is that they go to the Gibeonites and say, we made a mess here. I know we defeated you, but we did it wrong. What would you like? And they say, we want you to sacrifice all the male descendants of Saul. And David says, fair dues. So the male descendants of Saul are sacrificed. The Bible does not criticise that. But what David agrees to is for their bodies to be left exposed on the hillside. And Rizpah, who's the mom of two of them, knows that although the loss of her sons is appalling, that what David is doing here is just plain wrong. Because God's law says you do not leave bodies between death and the burial. And what she does is not sit in her house and mope. What she does is she gets a sheepskin and she gets something else. And she goes out to where the bodies are and she defends the bodies for 6 months, living outside in the open air with a rug. And wild beasts come and the birds of the air come and she defends the bodies. But she does it because of where they are. It's slap opposite David's palace. And every day this woman is a visible symbol of the challenge to the ruler about godly living. So my last question to you is, how can you use simple living, simple gestures as godly gestures to challenge the ways of this world? It might be that you wear black on Thursdays. It might be, do you remember in the 1970s and 80s when we wouldn't buy South African fruit? And we'd march into the greengrocers and say, are these from South Africa? And they'd say yes, and we'd say, I'm not buying them then, and we'd march out again. I don't know what it achieved, but we felt very virtuous. How can you live in a way which is better for the world, but which also gives a message to the world about that which the Lord requires us, which is, of course, to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly, claiming this as God's world? Thank you, Rachel.